Early March 1945. High above central Honshu, the air is thin and bitterly cold. At 25,000 feet, sunlight catches the edges of contrails stretching across the morning sky. Below, the land is quiet. Cities still intact. Factories still running. Civilians beginning another day beneath the assumption that distance remains their shield. Then the radar screens flicker. Japanese air defense stations track formations approaching from the east. At first, the signatures look familiar. Heavy bombers, slow and deliberate. The kind Japan has learned to intercept at great cost. Fighters scramble from nearby airfields, engines straining as pilots climb toward altitude. But something is wrong. Ahead of the bombers, moving faster and higher than expected, are smaller contacts. They are not retreating at the coastline. They're not turning back over the sea. They're already there, circling, waiting. American fighters. For years, Japanese pilots have believed this moment was impossible. The distances were too vast. The fuel requirements too extreme. No enemy fighter, they were told, could reach the heart of the homeland and still fight. Yet now, above their own cities, sleek silhouettes cut through the sky with confidence. The rules of the air war have quietly, irrevocably changed, and that realization carries consequences far beyond this single morning. To understand why the appearance of American fighters over Japan produced such fear, one must return to the assumptions that shaped the Pacific Air War from its very beginning. In 1941, the Japanese Empire entered the conflict with a deep belief in geography as a weapon. The Pacific Ocean was not merely a battlefield. It was a defensive moat. Thousands of miles of open water separated the Japanese home islands from American industrial centers. This distance, Japanese planners believed, would delay any serious threat long enough for Japan to secure a negotiated settlement. Japanese air doctrine reflected this confidence. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force and the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service emphasized short to medium-range fighters optimized for maneuverability and climb rather than endurance. Aircraft like the Mitsubishi A6M0 were designed to dominate local airspace, especially over naval task forces and island chains. Range mattered, but not the kind of range required to escort bombers across oceans or deep into enemy territory. Early victories reinforced this thinking. In 1941 and 1942, Japanese pilots achieved stunning success across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Allied air forces were caught unprepared. Bases fell quickly. Fighters with longer range, but heavier frames were often outmatched in close combat. To Japanese aviators, air superiority seemed tied to pilot skill and tactical finesse, not industrial scale or logistical reach. Meanwhile, the United States faced its own limitations. In the early years of the war, American fighters simply could not escort heavy bombers over long distances. The Boeing B-17 and consolidated B-24 had impressive range and defensive armament, but their escorts did not. American planners accepted that bombers would often fly alone, relying on formation firepower rather than protection. This reality shaped U.S. air doctrine in both Europe and the Pacific. For Japan, this was reassuring. Even if American bombers someday reached the home islands, Japanese commanders assumed they would arrive unsupported, vulnerable to interception, attrition, and exhaustion. The idea that enemy fighters could roam freely over Japanese skies, engage defenders at will, and still return safely seemed beyond technological reach. Geography appeared to confirm this belief. From the Marianas to Tokyo lay more than 1,500 miles of open ocean. Fighter aircraft of the early 1940s simply did not have the fuel capacity to make such journeys and still fight effectively. Every calculation favored the defender. But as the war dragged on, the balance began to shift. By 1943, Japan's air forces were already under strain. Losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea campaigns were severe. Veteran pilots, men who had trained for years in peacetime, were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Training programs were shortened. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. The qualitative edge Japan once held began to erode. At the same time, American industrial output surged. Aircraft production expanded at a pace unmatched in history. New designs were not only replacing losses but surpassing earlier limitations. Engineers focused on reliability, altitude performance, and, most critically, range. Yet even as American bombers grew more capable, Japanese planners remained confident in one key assumption: fighters would not follow. Air defense of the home islands was built around interception, radar detection, rapid climb, and concentrated attack against unescorted bombers. This system was imperfect, but familiar. It was designed for a world in which the enemy arrived alone. What Japanese commanders did not yet realize was that this world was already disappearing. Because while Japanese air defenses focused on what they knew, American planners were preparing to erase distance itself as a meaningful barrier. And that effort would soon move from design tables and test fields into the skies above the Pacific. By 1944, the air war in the Pacific had entered a fundamentally new phase, one defined less by isolated battles and more by reach. Distance, once Japan's greatest ally, was being steadily dismantled by American strategy, engineering, and logistics. At the center of this transformation stood the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Conceived before the war, but perfected under immense pressure, the B-29 was unlike any bomber Japan had faced. It flew higher, farther, and faster than previous designs. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to operate at altitudes where interception was difficult. Its range placed the Japanese home islands within reach once the United States secured forward bases. Those bases came in the form of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, captured in the summer of 1944 after brutal fighting. From these volcanic islands, American bombers could reach Japan directly. The strategic logic was unmistakable. Japan could now be attacked without relying on carriers or intermediate staging points. Initially, even this development did not alarm Japanese air planners as deeply as it might have. B-29 raids in late 1944 were high-altitude, daylight operations. Weather, mechanical problems, and navigation challenges limited their effectiveness. Most importantly, the bombers often arrived without fighter escort. Japanese interceptors could still climb to meet them, engage, and withdraw. Then another piece of the puzzle fell into place. The North American P-51 Mustang had already transformed the air war in Europe. Equipped with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and capable of carrying external fuel tanks, the Mustang combined speed, altitude performance, and unprecedented range. In Europe, it escorted bombers deep into Germany and hunted enemy aircraft far from their bases. In the Pacific, its potential was even more disruptive. For months, the idea of escorting bombers all the way to Japan remained theoretical. There was nowhere for fighters to land, no margin for error. A damaged aircraft or a miscalculation meant certain loss. But American planners were willing to accept those risks if they could reduce bomber casualties and crush Japanese air defenses. The breakthrough came with the capture of Iwo Jima in February 1945. Officially, the island's value lay in emergency landing fields for damaged bombers. In reality, it became a forward stepping stone for fighter operations. From Iwo Jima, P-51s could reach Japan, escort bombers, engage defenders, and return. The first fighter escorts over Japan were limited and cautious. Weather was unpredictable. Navigation over open ocean left no room for error. But with each mission, confidence grew. Mustangs arrived earlier than expected. They stayed longer. They fought aggressively. 4 Japanese pilots. This was a shock that cut deeper than any single loss. American fighters were no longer confined to the edges of battle. They were not reacting. They were controlling the airspace. They met Japanese interceptors head-on, often at altitude, with superior speed and energy. When Japanese pilots disengaged, the Americans followed, something Japanese doctrine had rarely prepared them to face. Equally devastating was the psychological effect. Japanese pilots took off knowing that the enemy would already be above them. Climb rates, once a point of pride, no longer guaranteed safety. Fuel reserves dwindled faster in prolonged engagements. Returning to base was no longer assured. By early 1945, the defensive logic underpinning Japan's air strategy was unraveling. The homeland was no longer protected by distance. The skies were no longer predictable, and the enemy was no longer just passing through. American fighters were staying, and their presence would soon force every level of Japanese command, and every pilot who took to the air to confront a new and terrifying reality. For Japanese pilots in early 1945, the sky over their homeland had become a theater of disbelief. Many were veterans of the early Pacific campaigns, men who had fought in the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Philippines. They were trained to dominate the air locally, relying on maneuverability, surprise, and knowledge of terrain. Yet, when the first American Mustangs arrived over Honshu, those assumptions were shattered. Pilots scrambled at all hours, sometimes climbing through clouds to meet formations that seemed to appear from nowhere. Reports from the time describe a strange combination of awe and fear. A veteran pilot recalled seeing the American fighters gliding higher than we had ever dared, faster than our engines could push us. Interception strategies, once rehearsed endlessly at airfields, failed to account for aircraft that could follow bombers over hundreds of miles of ocean and remain combat-ready. The psychological effect was immediate. Pilots who had once felt invincible in their Zeros or Key 84s now questioned whether altitude, tactics, or sheer courage could protect them. Exhaustion became as deadly as enemy fire. Each mission was a test of survival against a foe whose very presence over their homeland was impossible until happened. This terror was compounded by the knowledge that reinforcements were scarce. Fuel shortages and mechanical were limited sorties, while Japan's pilot training programs could no longer replace losses effectively. The air itself, once familiar and protective, now seemed a domain controlled by Americans. American technological advances were the engine of this shock. The combination of the P-51 Mustang and long-range fuel tanks transformed air operations. Previously, fighters were tethered to local bases. They could only provide short escort windows. The Mustang's external drop tanks allowed continuous coverage deep over Japanese territory, giving bombers a shield that Japanese pilots had never encountered. Equally important was engine performance. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine maintained power at higher altitudes, enabling Mustangs to climb and maneuver above Japanese interceptors. Radar-assisted navigation and precise intelligence on Japanese positions further ensured that American fighters arrived at the right place and time. This technology nullified many of Japan's advantages. Fighters that once relied on superior agility found themselves outpaced. Bombers that had been vulnerable became moving fortresses with protective screens that could engage attackers relentlessly. Each sortie demonstrated to Japanese pilots and commanders that the technological balance of the war had shifted irreversibly. Tactically, the introduction of long-range American fighters forced Japanese commanders to rethink every engagement. Scrambles were no longer guaranteed to meet bombers over open water. Encounters now occurred directly over cities, factories, and civilian populations, ground that had once been safe. Japanese intercept strategies, based on altitude, climbing, and head-on attacks, often failed. The Americans dictated the timing and location of engagements. Formation discipline among P-51s meant that even if a Japanese pilot managed to evade one fighter, another would be waiting. Climbing or diving to gain an advantage could be futile, as American pilots had superior energy management and situational awareness. The result was a series of encounters that, though relatively small in numbers, had an outsized impact. Japanese aircrews were being worn down not only by losses, but by the constant knowledge that every mission was a gamble against an enemy that could sustain operations longer, higher, and faster than they could. The arrival of American fighters over Japan challenged Japanese leadership at every level. Air defense doctrine had been built around the premise of short-range interceptions. Commanders relied on radar stations, warning networks, and pre-positioned fighter units to meet incoming threats over predictable approaches. Now, those calculations were unreliable. High-ranking officers faced a crisis of adaptation. Resources were finite, yet the Americans could choose where and when to strike. Every scramble risked exposing pilots to superior enemy aircraft, yet inaction was equally dangerous. Orders became fragmented, sometimes contradictory. Some units were instructed to engage immediately, others to conserve fuel and avoid losses. Confusion and frustration grew, eroding the coherence of Japan's defensive strategy. Reports from headquarters emphasized the psychological strain. Pilots were described as hesitant or hesitating too long, terms rare in the disciplined Imperial Air Force. Commanders knew that training programs could no longer replace losses quickly. Each failure was magnified, not just in terms of tactical defeat, but in the collapse of morale across the chain of command. From the American side, the strategy was deliberate and methodical. Commanders understood the importance of fighter escorts, not only for bomber protection, but as a psychological weapon. The P-51s were trained to engage decisively, using altitude advantage and formation tactics. Pilots reported that Japanese reactions often vacillated between aggression and panic, providing opportunities to strike decisively while minimizing risk to bombers. Operational planning emphasized endurance, timing, and coordination with radar and reconnaissance. The Americans had calculated every detail: range, refueling options, and target approach. Each mission reinforced the growing mastery over the airspace above Japan. For U.S. pilots, the sight of enemy fighters scrambling in confusion over the islands was confirmation that air superiority was no longer theoretical. It was tangible. The impact on Japanese morale cannot be overstated. Beyond losses and tactical failures, the mere presence of American fighters over Japanese cities eroded confidence in the military system itself. Pilots described feelings of dread even before takeoff. Civilian populations, once shielded by distance, now observed American aircraft overhead, deepening the perception that the homeland was no longer secure. This psychological strain was compounded by repeated raids. Continuous exposure to high-altitude bombers and their escorts created exhaustion, anxiety, and fear. Pilots who survived multiple engagements returned to airfields emotionally drained. Commanders struggled to maintain discipline. Even the most experienced aviators questioned whether skill and courage could overcome the relentless technological and tactical superiority now in the sky. The combination of these angles, individual fear, technological advantage, tactical dominance, leadership strain, and psychological pressure, created a perfect storm. By early 1945, the Japanese air defense system was reacting to circumstances rather than shaping them. The next step in the story is the decisive turning point. The missions over the Japanese homeland that revealed the full scope of American air power. Every struggle, every adaptation, and every failure led to a climactic confrontation that would determine the final months of the Pacific Air War. The climax of Japan's air defense crisis unfolded in early 1945 as American long-range fighters began sustained operations over the home islands. The first fully coordinated missions occurred in February and March, following the capture of Iwo Jima, which allowed P-51 Mustangs to accompany B-29 superfortresses on bombing runs deep into Honshu. On March 4th, 1945, the Americans launched one of the earliest major escort missions. More than 100 B-29s targeted industrial areas near Tokyo, while 120 P-51s escorted them from Iwo Jima. Japanese radar stations detected the formations, but the presence of the fighters far exceeded expectations. Pilots on alert scrambled from airfields near Tokyo and the Kanto Plain, climbing through dense clouds into bitterly cold air. Initial engagements were chaotic. Japanese interceptors, accustomed to unescorted bombers, found themselves facing an enemy with superior speed, climb rate, and coordinated tactics. Mustangs were patient yet aggressive, shadowing bombers, intercepting attacks, and diving on Japanese planes with precision. In many cases, a single Mustang could engage multiple enemy fighters, exploiting its performance advantage at high altitude. Eyewitness accounts describe a sense of disbelief among Japanese pilots. One officer later wrote in his journal, "We expected bombers, perhaps a few fighters at the edge, but these American planes were already above us, ready and waiting." There was nothing familiar in the sky. Fuel management, previously a predictable calculation, now dictated life or death. Many pilots ran out of reserves before completing their missions, forced to bail out over unfamiliar terrain or the sea. The losses were immediate and severe. While precise figures vary, reports indicate that Japanese interceptor squadrons lost between 20 to 30 aircraft during the initial raids, with several experienced pilots killed or captured. The combination of attrition and surprise created a cascading effect. Remaining units hesitated to scramble, unsure of how to engage effectively. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion as mission after mission met with the same pattern. The Americans controlled altitude, timing, and engagement. At the same time, the American pilots achieved their primary objectives. B-29s reached their targets largely unscathed, dropping tonnage on factories, rail yards, and military installations. Fighter escorts returned to Iwo Jima with minimal losses, confirming that sustained air dominance over the Japanese mainland was not only possible but operationally repeatable. The psychological impact was equally significant. Japanese pilots and ground crews watched in disbelief as enemy fighters routinely appeared over cities once considered safe. The doctrine of defensive depth, relying on distance and interception, had been rendered obsolete. Every pilot and commander now faced the realization that the airspace over Japan was no longer controlled by their own forces. This turning point extended beyond a single engagement. The March raids demonstrated the combined effect of American technology, strategy, and logistics. Long-range fighters were not just a tactical asset. They were a strategic weapon, projecting power directly into the Japanese homeland. From this moment, Japan's air defense would be forced into a reactive posture, responding to threats rather than dictating terms of engagement. The stage was set for a series of escalating missions in the following months, with a cumulative effect of constant American air presence would erode both material capacity and morale. It was in these months, under relentless pressure from high-altitude escorts and bomber formations, that Japan's air forces confronted the limits of endurance, training, and technological parity. By April 1945, the presence of American fighters over Japan had become routine, yet no less devastating. The capture of Iwo Jima had provided an essential bridge, allowing P-51 Mustangs to maintain a constant escort over B-29 formations. Each mission confirmed that Japanese pilots could no longer dictate the terms of engagement. On April 7th, a particularly large raid targeted Osaka and its surrounding industrial zones. Over 200 B-29s were escorted by nearly 150 P-51s. Japanese radar stations detected the approach, but the defenders faced an impossible choice: engage immediately with limited altitude advantage or risk allowing bombers to strike unimpeded. Both options carried near certain danger. When Japanese fighters scrambled, they encountered the American escorts at altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet. The Mustangs dominated the vertical plane, diving to intercept and climbing back before Japanese planes could recover. For the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, every maneuver felt reactive, a desperate attempt to regain control in a sky dominated by an unseen hand. Reports from the time describe repeated attempts to reach the bombers, only to be repelled by superior aircraft energy and coordination. Fuel management, already a constant concern, became a decisive factor. Many Japanese fighters could not sustain prolonged climbs, and those that did often lacked the endurance to return safely to base. Pilots were forced to make split-second decisions: engage, disengage, or risk running out of fuel mid-flight. The cumulative effect of these missions created an unprecedented level of fatigue. Veteran pilots began to question whether training or skill could ever compensate for the technological gap they now faced. The psychological toll was mirrored in command structures. Orders became increasingly fragmented as leaders attempted to anticipate the American approach. Airfields reported confusion and hesitation. Pilots waited for directives that often arrived too late. The doctrine of interception, once the backbone of homeland defense, was collapsing under the pressure of sustained American operations. At the operational level, the impact was decisive. Factories in Osaka, Tokyo, and Nagoya suffered repeated damage. Rail networks, supply depots, and military installations were consistently disrupted. B-29 formations, protected by P-51s, could strike deep into the industrial heartland of Japan with limited losses. The combination of strategic bombing and escort superiority demonstrated that the Japanese air defense system was no longer capable of controlling the skies. By late April, the situation had reached a tipping point. Japanese pilots who survived one mission faced the prospect of the next, fully aware that American fighters could appear anywhere, anytime, and would not hesitate to engage. The psychological dominance established by this air campaign created fear that spread from the front lines to civilian populations. The realization was stark. The homeland was no longer invulnerable, and the defenders' ability to protect it was irreversibly diminished. The turning point was not a single engagement or a single loss. It was the cumulative effect, the relentless pressure, the technological superiority, and the unbroken presence of American fighters that shattered Japan's air defense confidence. From this moment forward, every sortie over Honshu became a struggle against not only an enemy in the sky, but against the awareness that the very nature of warfare had changed. With the skies dominated, the narrative now moves to the aftermath, examining the strategic, operational, and human consequences that reshaped the final months of the Pacific War. The consequences of sustained American fighter operations over Japan were immediate and far-reaching. By mid-1945, the Imperial Japanese Air Forces had lost both material and morale at unprecedented rates. Pilots, previously trained to operate with confidence over home territory, were now acutely aware that each mission carried extreme risk. The very act of taking off became a psychological burden, as airmen faced enemies who could strike first, climb higher, and disengage at will. Industrial and civilian targets suffered repeated bombardment. B-29 superfortresses, escorted by P-51 Mustangs, struck factories producing aircraft, ships, and munitions with increasing regularity. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya experienced both direct damage from bombing and indirect effects from disrupted logistics. Rail lines, communication networks, and fuel depots were systematically degraded, making it difficult for Japan to replace lost equipment or reorganize defensive efforts. Japanese fighter losses were significant. According to wartime records, hundreds of aircraft were destroyed in sorties defending the homeland, and a growing number of experienced pilots were killed or captured. Training programs could not keep pace, leaving new pilots underprepared for the challenges of engaging long-range American escorts. The cumulative effect created a cycle. Inexperienced pilots faced advanced technology, suffered high casualties, and further weakened the overall defensive capability. The psychological toll extended beyond individual airmen. Commanders struggled to adapt to a rapidly changing battlefield. Traditional strategies that had guided air defense for years, scrambles, altitude advantage, and coordinated interceptions, proved ineffective against American tactics. High-ranking officers reported confusion and low morale among units, noting that repeated failures were eroding the confidence of even the most experienced pilots. At the operational level, the effectiveness of American fighter escorts confirmed the growing dominance of Allied air power. Japanese planners recognized that distance was no longer a sufficient defense. The assumption that the Pacific Ocean could shield the homeland had been decisively invalidated. American air operations had not only destroyed physical targets, but also shattered the perception of invulnerability that had guided Japanese strategy since the outbreak of war. The stage was set for the final months of the Pacific conflict. The inability of Japanese air forces to counter the dual threat of B-29 bombers and their fighter escorts accelerated the collapse of defensive operations, making the homeland increasingly vulnerable to both air attack and strategic decision-making pressures at the highest levels of command. The longer-term consequences of American air superiority over Japan became increasingly apparent in May and June 1945. Japanese airfields were depleted of both aircraft and fuel. Veteran pilots were irreplaceable, and many of those who remained were young, inexperienced, and ill-prepared for the demands of high-altitude interception against advanced American fighters. Each sortie over Honshu carried the constant risk of failure, capture, or death. Industrial production suffered devastating blows. Factories producing aircraft engines, munitions, and components for ships were repeatedly targeted by high-altitude bombers with minimal interference. Rail lines, ports, and communication hubs were damaged or destroyed, slowing the movement of supplies and troops. Even where infrastructure survived, the fear of immediate American airstrikes forced work stoppages and disrupted coordination. The psychological effect on civilians was profound. The skies above cities were no longer a distant battlefield, but a constant threat, reminding the population that the war had arrived at their doorstep. Strategically, the dominance of American fighters shifted Japan from a posture of defense to one of desperate reaction. Commanders struggled to allocate scarce resources, often sending out pilots to intercept formations they could neither predict nor effectively engage. Scrambles became reactive rather than proactive. Japanese air doctrine, once a source of pride and tactical efficiency, disintegrated under the relentless pressure of superior enemy air power. The human cost was severe. Records indicate significant attrition among remaining skilled pilots, leaving younger, undertrained aviators to face overwhelming odds. Survivors reported high levels of stress, fatigue, and fear. These psychological pressures, combined with the tangible losses of aircraft and infrastructure, left Japanese air forces in a weakened state that could not recover in the final months of the war. For the Americans, the combination of B-29s and long-range fighter escorts proved decisive. Not only were bombing campaigns more effective, but the mere presence of P-51s in Japanese skies forced enemy pilots into constant vigilance, disrupting training, morale, and defensive cohesion. American reports emphasize the psychological as well as tactical impact of sustained escort missions, confirming that air superiority was no longer merely about controlling the sky, but about dominating the minds and reactions of the enemy. The relentless pressure exerted by these operations paved the way for the final Allied advances in the Pacific. Japan's inability to mount an effective air defense over its own homeland contributed directly to the broader collapse of military capability, signaling that the war had decisively turned in favor of the Allies. The presence of American fighters over Japanese cities had transformed not only the physical battlefield, but the psychological landscape of the war itself. The story of American fighters appearing over the Japanese homeland is more than a tale of technology or tactics. It is a narrative of transformation in modern warfare. For decades, geography had been a natural defense. The vast Pacific Ocean was assumed to shield Japan, providing both time and distance against any enemy threat. That assumption, once foundational, proved fragile against the combined force of innovation, industrial capacity, and operational daring. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots illustrates the human dimension of this transformation. Skill and courage, once sufficient to dominate local airspace, could not overcome the reach and endurance of the P-51 Mustang. Training, doctrine, and experience mattered less when confronted with a force that could dictate the terms of engagement. The terror, fatigue, and uncertainty these pilots experienced remind us that warfare is as much a contest of perception and morale as of bombs and bullets. Technologically, the missions over Japan marked a turning point. Long-range fighters and escort strategies erased distance as a protective barrier. They redefined what was possible in aerial warfare, showing that industrial production, innovation, and planning could project power far beyond traditional limits. The lessons of these operations reverberate through military history. Control of the air can alter not only immediate outcomes, but also the strategic psychology of an enemy nation. Yet the story is also a somber reflection on the costs of war. Cities, infrastructure, and civilians bore the consequences of air campaigns that reached across oceans. Skilled pilots lost their lives confronting an overwhelming foe. Entire defensive systems, honed over years, were rendered obsolete in a matter of months. The air war over Japan stands as a testament to both human ingenuity and human vulnerability, a reminder that the skies above can become a theater of both awe and fear. Ultimately, the arrival of American fighters over Japan was a defining moment in the Pacific War. It marked the collapse of the homeland's protective illusions, the dominance of Allied air power, and the limits of conventional doctrine when confronted by relentless technological and operational superiority. In that convergence of skill, innovation, and courage, history itself was reshaped above the clouds of Honshu.